Hello and welcome to a brand new miniature painting video series from Heroes Infinite. Today we are going to be painting Lady Elaria, the Screaming Bridesmaid, and she is from the Night of the Cursed Vows, the Vampire Groom and the Ghostly Bride release. This release is currently available at a super low price, so head on over to heroesinfinite.com and treat yourself to a truly wonderful miniature experience. So, painting the skin, guys. I started here with using purple from AK Interactive. And as you can see here, I'm going through and I'm painting in the deepest shadows first. I'm not painting over the areas where I want light, not too much anyway. But I'm trying to establish the deepest colour here. Now, what we're going to do here next is we're going to slowly add blue-grey into the mix. So here is the first level. There's quite a bit of blue-grey here because we want the skin to be light. We're painting in all the areas that we haven't painted so far with the purple. So we're leaving quite a sharp contrast here between the light areas and the shadow areas. Now this is going to look quite stark at first. Now to blend those two layers together, I've done an intermediary mix of purple and blue-grey, and I'm just feathering here between the two layers of paint. So I'm just painting on the borders and the edges of the very light tone and the darker shadow tone. Now this can take a few layers. But what will happen is you'll slowly see that line between the two will start to go fuzzy and hazy, and you'll get a nice blend between the two colours. So we've added in even more blue-grey now, and I'm going to be adding just the main highlights here. And as you can see, this paint is very light. It's looking like it's almost white, but it's not. And we're just getting the very tips of the muscles, the very top areas of the breast parts, and we're trying to focus on the light coming from above. Now we're blending those two layers again, and the same as before, we're just doing the intermediate mix of the lighter color we just used and the previous color, and again just hazing out the edges. We're now on to painting the dress, and the first part is the top half of the dress, which we're painting in this beautiful purple colour. And I'm doing similar to the skin here, where I've taken King Purple from AK and I'm mapping in where all the dark shadow areas on this garment would be. So now we're adding the first highlight, or maybe what we call a mid-tone. This is just done with AK Purple. And I'm painting here over all the areas where I feel like I've left the undercoat showing. So I'm definitively trying to leave the darker shadows in place where I put them. I'm now doing the same as I did before, where I've mixed up an in-between layer of the two, and I'm blending those two together by, again, running the brush very lightly along the seams of the paint or the edges of the brush lines. We're adding the first main highlight now, and I've added blue-grey into the purple. You'll notice through this that I use blue-grey as a constant colour for my highlighting to keep the tones quite similar and to create some harmony. More blending now, so I've mixed up that intermediary mix, and I'm just doing as I did before, just on a smaller area this time because the highlights are smaller. The last step in the dress here was I mixed up a glaze, a very thin mix of the King Purple, and I'm brushing it over most of the surface here, which is going to tone the light colours down a bit, but it's also going to homogenise the surface and smooth it out. Right, we're painting the green part of the dress now, and the first layer I'm adding here is deep green from AK. which is a beautiful colour. But we're going the opposite way this time. So I'm painting in the mid-tones and over the highlight area first, as I want this green tone to be the more prominent colour here. So here you can see now I'm going the opposite, where I've added some king purple into the deep green, and I'm now brushing that into the shadows. This is a little bit lighter than the mix I used before, a little bit more diluted, as I want a bit of a softer edge here. So we've added some blue-grey to the mix now, to the original deep green, and I'm painting in all the highlight zones and focusing on all the areas which I think will catch the light and will be looking upwards in terms of where they face. We're now doing some blending again, and I've mixed that in-between mix again of the previous colour and the darker colour, and I'm just feathering out over the edges very softly and trying to build a gradient in these areas where the brush strokes can be seen and there looks like there's sort of like a sharp line between the two colours. It takes several goes. I go over and over this several times, but eventually we get a nice smooth edge there. Now I've added in more blue-grey here, and I'm picking out the little edges and the main highlights of the model. And I just keep building up till there's a nice amount of brightness on each part. Final stage here is I'm adding snow blue into the mix. And I'm adding this onto tiniest little highlights where I want a little bit more of a pop on certain areas. I also go back here with a previous mix and I lightly blend in those final highlights. For painting the veil, I made up a mix of deep green, a little bit of Ducat blue and a little bit of black just to darken this up. And we're going back to the previous method we used here, where I'm painting in all the shadows first. I'm trying to get a nice deep dark tone in those shadow areas. Now for the main light, I've gone with deep green and Ducat blue. And I'm painting in all the areas that I haven't painted previously with the shadow mix. And as you can see as we go along here, we already get a really nice feeling of contrast when we paint this way. And this builds up a really nice tone for this veil, which is going to look really nice. Now to blend those together, I've mixed up a little in-between mix of the two previous colours. And I slowly go around and I just feather this paint in between the two layers. It's thinned down a little bit, but not a great deal, but it's enough to just bridge the gap between those two colours. So for the final highlight here, I've added more and more blue-grey, and again we're using blue-grey again, and I build up these highlights quite slowly. It's a slightly thinned down mix this, and I build up the highlight, let it dry, and then I come back and I add an even smaller highlight on top of that with the same mix. This builds a transition and a bright surface. On to painting the vines. Now the first layer of paint here I've used is dark brown, which is a really cool colour from AK. And I just base coat all of these in one go and give a nice solid coat of this darkish brown colour. Now for the first highlight, I've added in golden olive here to give a sort of greeny brown tone to these. And I slowly just build up like what I would call the mid-tone up to the highlight areas. For the final highlight on these and for all the little thorns and stuff, I've added in buff from AK Interactive. Quite a nice light tone here, and it's quite a bright jump. So I want certain areas like the thorns, which are meant to be quite sharp and spiky, I want them to stand out and be quite prominent when these vines are looked at. Now we're on to painting the gold on Elaria. Always one of my favourite bits to paint. So I'm trying to do a more reddish brownish gold here. So I'm base coating with dirty red, which may not seem the most obvious colour, but it works out nice in the end. We build up a nice solid colour of the base dirty red. For the first main light, the mid-tone, I've added dirty red with some Japanese brown, which is a nice sort of muddy orangey colour. And I just go over all the areas here, trying to hit all the points where I think the light is going to hit. But more importantly, leaving some of that dirty red showing. It's very important to have quite extreme dark to extreme light colours when we're doing NMM. Now for the main highlight, I've gone with straight Japanese brown here. Quite a nice sort of yellowy greeny brown, green yellow this. Works really nice for golds. I use it an awful lot. So I'm just here trying to define where the bright spots will be on the gold. And I build this up over several layers. For the first main highlight, I add in pale yellow. And the areas I'm painting here are just getting smaller and smaller and really trying to push those what we call bright spots and make them stand out even more. I feather the paint in over the edges of where I've painted here as well, trying to get as smooth a transition as I can. This is mainly done with thinner paint, so rather than blending between layers here, I can paint with a thinner paint and actually build the highlights and make a transition as I go. Moving on to the final highlight here, and I've added in even more pale yellow, and this is almost pure pale yellow now, which is, it's almost white, but it's got a yellow tint to it. And I'm just hitting the very top spots and the brightest points with this layer of paint. As you can see here, a lot of it is like, it's almost like very small dots in areas, which just give that little bit of bling that we want on gold. So for painting gems, I'd already base coated them in dirty red when I did the gold. And the first layer here is Bordeaux red, where I just define the shiny areas. I've added in a little bit of pale yellow now, and I'm just painting inside the area I've already painted. With gems, they're a bit like a metallic surface where we want to build up very small areas of bright spots. So more pale yellow is added here, and it's getting very, very light, and we're literally painting little slithers at the bottom of that gem and at the top of the other gem. And for the final highlight, I've gone to almost pure white here, and we literally want to paint just a little tiny dot in those reflections. And I also do a dot at the top of the gems to add an upper reflection to make the surface look like it's actually shiny and reflecting the light. Okay, on to doing the bouquet. The first part I done was the whitish leaves and handle part. So for this I mixed up grey blue with mud brown, which makes a nice sort of a muddy bluish tone, which works really well for white. Painted this all over. And to this I then add in some ivory to get a lighter and lighter tone, and then I build up the highlights with this thin down paint, trying to cover most of the surface with the first layer. So as you can see, it's not quite white, it needs to be an off-white, but we're building that up. Now more and more ivory is added in here for these final highlights, and I'm just getting on the very crisp edges here, and this will look whitish. When we're painting white stuff, we very rarely use white because it tends to look too stark, but here this builds up to a really nice sort of ivory tone. So we're on to doing the roses now, and the first layer was done with dirty red and king purple, and we're building up the first layers of highlight here with matte red, blood red, excuse me. To the blood red, I'm then adding in cadmium red, and we're just hitting the tops of each of the little leaves that come up. We're trying to get quite bright, crisp highlights on here. We get those up to a really nice finish here. Quite bright at the end with a little bit of ivory added. For the sword blade, the first layer I added was ocean blue with a little bit of grey blue and a little tiny bit of king purple to give us a nice brightish tone for the upper facing parts of the blade. I wanted a nice sort of bluish tone here to show through in the overall part. Now for the lower parts of the blade, I've added more king purple in so that we get a much darker tone on the lower side of the blade. This is important with this sword, this NMM, so we want it to look quite reflective. So having the darker underneath side there will help with selling the effect of it being a shiny, bright NMM sword. Now, for the first highlight on the upper part, I've added in grey blue. And as you can see here, the paint is quite thinned down, and I pick out little areas along the blade, which are going to be our shine spots. So we pick out little sections, and I think I've got 2 sections on this upper part of the blade, you can see, which I'm painting in with quite thinned down paint. And what I do here is I go over several times, trying to enforce the gradient to be nice and smooth. The next highlight we add is just more grey blue. Now I'm painting inside the previous areas, so these highlights are getting smaller and smaller and brighter, and what we want to do here is build those to be quite shiny, and the only way we can do that is by adding brighter and brighter paint. I also take the time here each time to do the edge highlighting on the center part and the top part of the blade. The final highlight here is I've added in white, and I'm painting very small areas here, very small parts, which I want to be the shiniest parts here. Now, painting the swans, the first mix I had, the base coat, was a mix of black with dirty red, which makes this really nice sort of reddish brown colour, which I thought was perfect for these black swans, which are not going to be quite black. Now for the first highlight here on that mix, I've added in blue grey, and I'm going to build up to quite sharp highlights on the wings and the feathers. So we're going to paint the feathers along at the same time, which are going to be the same colour here. So I slowly go round. This is quite a thin down mix, although it looks quite bright, and I literally pick out all the areas which I think the light is going to catch on these sharp edges of the feathers and things like that. Also for the body here, I paint very small sharp lines to try and simulate feathers and fur, which I do with very thin down paint. And as I go along, I just add more and more blue-grey until I get the crispness and sharpness I want to sort of highlight these feathers and make them stand out. It ends up getting quite nice contrast, and I think looks really cool. So on to painting the bill and the face part. So I've base coated these, and the feet, the webbed feet of course, which I've base coated these all in Bordeaux red, which is a really nice sort of pinky red. It's not a true red, it's a lot more pinky and works really nice for parts like this. Now, as I'm adding this, for each highlight, I'm going to add in more and more pale yellow. And as you can see, we get this really nice pinky tone, but it's a soft tone. It's not a harsh, bright, sort of garish pink. And I quite like this for areas, organic areas like this. It works really nicely. So we just build up more and more highlights here. And eventually we get to a part where these parts look really nice. They contrast nice with the brown skin and the highlights of the main feathers. Now for the base, this was done very, very simply, very quick. I had dark green, dirty red and black on my palette. And I went round all the edges of the part with a dirty red and black mix, similar to the colour of the swans. And then I went round again and I just wet blend this, the dark grey green, I think it is, into the other colours.